So, today on our podcast, we continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. We're at the point where Mary is expanding her artistic skills while working in publishing, advertising, designing shop windows, designing sets for stage plays, and even designing a line of clothes for an established fashion brand. Most artists, once they leave the Disney studio, tend to fall away from Walt's social circle. There's only a few exceptions to this, such as Herb Ryman and, of course, Mary Blair. During the 1950s and early 1960s, no artist not presently employed by Disney was closer to Walt than Mary. They had a unique relationship in which Walt not only admired the work she did for the studio, but also the work she produced for other companies. But one of the difficulties in this arrangement was her husband Lee, who by this point struggled with his choice to become a business owner rather than continuing to be an artist, and because of this, he often needed the approval of other people in terms of his abilities and career decisions, including, somewhat oddly, from Walt himself. But we'll get to more on that in a moment. But before we launch into today's installment, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers. These here are the people who keep this whole enterprise running. I'm grateful to each and every Bandcamp subscriber because without them, this podcast would literally cease to exist. But going out today is a special note of thanks to a few new subscribers. These include Aaron, Bruce the Shark, Jay, Bicoastal Jen, and Swim ATM. Thanks to you and to all of our subscribers for keeping this podcast going. And now let's move into the show. As their income grew, the Blairs' lifestyle changed. Beyond their custom-built house, they had fashionable clothes, they ate in nice restaurants, and they traveled overseas, specifically to Europe. This was the first foreign travel that Mary had enjoyed since her Disney-sponsored trips to Latin America. In 1956, the Blairs, along with their two boys, went to Europe, where Mary's old colleague from Disney, Retta Scott, and her husband now lived. Officially, this was a business trip for Lee, who continued to make films for the International Nickel Company, whose offices were in Wales. Mary and Lee stayed in London for a few days, then went to Paris, where the four of them explored the city museums. Lee then took the boys home, Mary explained. It was during this period that she visited with Retta Scott. After returning home, Mary wrote to Walt about her travels, specifically the latter portion where she visited with Retta. "I stayed on in Europe for a month," she explained, "a while in Nice and surrounding country, a brief trip to Barcelona, then 2 weeks in the Scandinavian countries with a friend who now lives in Norway." She closed her letter by wishing that Walt would visit soon. "I don't know if you ever get to New York now, with your busy life there, but if you do, Lee and I and Kevin and Donovan would love to see you." Even though Walt and Mary hadn't seen each other in a few years, Walt continued to send elaborate Christmas gifts to Mary's kids, along with warm letters of encouragement and friendship to Mary herself. That Christmas, the Christmas of 1956, Mary, as usual, quickly penned her reply, which began, "We especially appreciate the letter. Nothing could be better than hearing from you and knowing what you're doing, my most favorite success story." She also said that during the coming summer, finally she planned to take the kids out to California, including a visit to the amusement park Walt had built in Anaheim. In 1957, Mary's work continued to shift more from illustrations for books and magazines to advertising. By this point, she had worked with a range of companies who largely sold food products and clothes to families with young children. For the meadow gold dairy, her designs were so central to the company's identity that Meadow Gold sold cloth dolls slightly taller than 2 feet that were based on Mary's advertising designs. Though the company claimed the dolls were valued at $12, they sold them by mail order for $3.50 plus proof of purchase from one Meadow Gold product. To make these dolls, Meadow Gold assigned Mary's designs, essentially the girl version of the Mary Blair children, to Inez Holland, a toy maker and publisher, who a decade earlier had turned characters in children's books into rag or cloth dolls. In the mid-1950s, Holland's company created a range of rag dolls and also jointed and posable dolls with plastic bodies. Holland now turned Mary's designs into a 2-foot cloth doll. Though animators had difficulty converting Mary's character designs into three-dimensional forms, largely because Mary's designs would be difficult to arrange with depth as they turned, Holland's company had no trouble creating these dolls. The dolls looked fabulous when one looked at them straight on, but their faces were a little flat in profile. This likely wouldn't bother the kids who played with them. But there was a design lesson here for Mary. Her stylized children looked pleasing in dimensional form so long as you could manage the sightline with which viewers observed them. The dolls were advertised as being created by Mary Blair, former Walt Disney artist. By this point, Mary was largely working with the advertising firm SSC&B, short for Sullivan, Stauffer, Caldwell and Bale. They were one of the hottest firms in Manhattan, whose accounts included Noxzema, Bayer Aspirin, a range of products from Johnson & Johnson, and Pall Mall cigarettes. Though art for a cigarette campaign seemed like it would be a poor match for Mary's family-centered design strengths, Joe Transina at SSC&B wanted to see if Mary's ability, with a nudge toward modernism and pop art, might produce a successful campaign for the brand. These ads incidentally came from inspiration, Mary explained, that the SSC&B art director, Joe Transina, received upon seeing the Picasso exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. In short, Transina suggested that Mary study Picasso's work as a way to expand her style to include more adult-focused products. Mary agreed to explore this approach, especially as MoMA was then presenting a special exhibit on Picasso's work in honor of the artist's 75th birthday. The shift in Mary's design style that summer is obvious and deeply tied to a Picasso influence. In earlier ad campaigns, Mary had relied on her stylized children as well as the flat and often geometric domestic environment that she had developed for the Little Golden Books. Now, however, she allowed elements of European modernism to reshape her design sensibilities. Already, Mary, like Picasso, relied on bold and often saturated colors to define her work, though now she experimented with some of the darker colors that Picasso at times favored. Also, like Picasso, for years she had shunned the illusion of depth and instead favored flattened spaces. But now she experimented with how stronger lines might transform her work. Picasso used lines to create overlapping planes and an expression of cubism. Mary, however, used similar lines to emphasize graphic elements and to provide an additional element of visual unity in her paintings. She was also influenced by Picasso's sense of borders. Up until this point, a typical Mary Blair commercial painting had a white border around it, with the figures, typically children, animals, or products, wholly presented inside of that border. Now she took a note from how Picasso laid out his canvases, where often the edge of a canvas interrupted the image, allowing viewers to imagine what wasn't there. In Picasso's works, he included figures whose heads, hats, or hair were only partially featured on the canvas itself, One of its portraits might include only the lower part of a subject's face, from chin up to the nose, with the remaining portion of their face existing in the ethereal and blank space above the canvas. Mary didn't employ anything as drastic as visually interrupting the human form, but she began to explore this conceptual approach of presentation with still objects. Her work for Pall Mall was distinctive and strong. In her painting for one ad, she presented a packet of cigarettes alongside apples, one of which was cut in half, and 2 individual cigarettes arranged in a decorative ashtray. The colors here are darker than that of previous works by Mary. The cigarette packet leaned toward a vivid scarlet or crimson. The background was defined by a deep purple. The edge of the canvas interrupts the presentation of one of the apples, as it also does the edge of the cigarette packet. In previous graphic designs for advertising, Mary's subjects typically existed within her usual white border, but now, like Picasso, her work suggested that the world expanded beyond the edge of the canvas. Her work also picked up geometric shapes such as squares and rectangles, where her previous paintings were more focused on curves and ovals. The square of the ashtray, the rectangular Pall Mall packet, and the straight, slender forms of 2 cigarettes. Most significantly, though, was the line work. Lines far darker, bolder, and thicker than those previously used by Mary now outlined the 2 cigarettes, drawing attention to them. As usual, her painting excluded text, as that would be added later to perfectly match the brand's design and logo. In part, Mary saw this work through the lens of an advertiser. She consciously combined cigarettes with a natural flavor such as an apple to make them more appealing. She also was deeply aware of the influence of Picasso, specifically, as she put it, heavy black outline that now separated these paintings from those done for earlier ad campaigns. Joe Trencina was pleased with her work. Her ads for this brand were unique and successful, helping to foster a long-term relationship between Mary, SSC&B, and Pall Mall. Her ads for Pall Mall, with fruit, geometric elements, and heavy line work, would run for 2 complete national campaigns, again demonstrating that Mary's work could speak to a large audience. That summer, Lee and Mary took the kids to California. The trip was arranged to see family near San Jose, visit friends in and around Burbank, and also experience Disneyland. In the days leading up to that trip, Walt wrote Mary, I was delighted to hear that you, Lee, and the boys are finally coming out for a visit, and I have a room reserved for you at the Disneyland Hotel. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you." The Blairs flew on July 30th and went directly to Disneyland. Once at the park, Walt arranged for them to have VIP access, similar to that of celebrities and international dignitaries. For Mary, the visit was another surreal experience, where she found her designs for film now translated into themed areas and attractions. There was the Mad Tea Party based on Alice in Wonderland, an area in Storybook Land based on Cinderella, and the Dumbo Flying Elephants, which were based on a film she'd worked on during her early days at the studio. But there was one ride, Peter Pan Flight, which held a wealth of film designs initially inspired by Mary. For this ride, in small pirate ships, she and her family flew above London, then over Neverland, where they moved through a world that at least partially had been originated in watercolors Mary had made in Long Island. After 3 days at Disneyland, they flew via helicopter to Hollywood, where they visited with friends in and around Burbank. These visits included Walt, who was delighted to see Mary and the boys. The one oddity of these meetings centered on Lee. Owner of his own studio in New York, Lee made repeated suggestions to Walt that they, both as producers, now had a lot in common. He also repeatedly brought up promotional films that his firm had made largely for the International Nickel Company and inquired if Walt wanted to see them sometime in the near future, as he'd need to ship them to the Disney studio once he got home. Walt agreed to view them, though it's unclear if he had any real interest in watching the films, or if his answer was simply a polite response to keep the conversation pleasant. Regardless, Lee explained that once home he would happily send a couple of his films along to the studio so Walt can see what he was up to. When they finished with their visits in Burbank, the Blairs traveled to Morgan Hill and San Jose, where they visited Mary's mother and sisters. Gussie, by now with her husband, Henry Weymouth, owned and operated a paint store in Gilroy, California, not far from where the rest of Mary's family lived. The Blairs then returned to New York shortly before the school year began on September 4th. That year, Donovan was in 5th grade, Kevin was in 2nd grade. Another odd element of this trip was that Lee, not Mary, wrote a note thanking Walt for his generosity. Or at least that's how the note began. Both Mary, myself, and the children wish to thank you, Lee began, for the wonderful time and courtesy given us on our vacation trip to Disneyland and the studio. But shortly after that, Lee's message again turned back toward the films his company had made, wishing that Walt would take a look at his efforts. I will send you via Air Express 2 prints of the various films we are doing for the International Nickel Company, Lee said. One is Mining for Nickel, and the other is on Milling and Smelting the Sudbury Nickel Ores. They're both about an hour in length, so don't attempt screening them together unless you have a cup of strong coffee between them. They are aimed primarily for group meetings of technical people in the industry, and so far have proven to be quite useful for that purpose. It was certainly good to see the studio so busy, and thanks again for the luncheon and the tour of the new stages. After Lee's letter arrived, Walt's secretary informed Lee that Walt was in Europe, which prodded Lee to write another letter again explaining the films he wanted to ship. The films that I planned to send for Walt to screen, he started. I mentioned them to him during our last visit, and he expressed interest in seeing some of the industrial films we're producing. If nothing else, these letters present the image of a man who is searching for ways to validate his career choices, the shift from art and film production to that of being a producer and a business owner. It was clear to most that Lee longed to focus on art again and to reestablish his name as a rising American artist, but he had little time for that. There's also a note of personal desperation in these conversations and letters, a sense that Lee needed outside approval to make himself feel better about his current professional life. After all, what might films on nickel mining offer the Disney studio, other than to be an opportunity for Lee to receive some muted praise? But validation, at least from Walt, never came. It's unclear what, if anything, happened with the films that Lee sent to Walt. If Walt was irritated with Lee, he simply brushed it off. For years, Walt's connection to the Blairs had been almost entirely focused on Mary, not her husband. So this was how their relationship continued moving forward. In December, Walt sent a note primarily to Mary. It was wonderful to see you and your fine boys when you were out here this summer, and I hope you'll be able to come out again soon. This is just a little note to let you know I'm thinking of you and wishing you a very Merry Christmas. The remainder of the 1950s were a good period for Mary. Her kids moved through school, even if Kevin, her younger son, struggled with some subjects such as English. Mary continued with her work in advertising and in illustration. She also designed some of her own clothes, which a tailor made for her in New York. In 1960, she sent Jacqueline Kennedy, whose husband, John F. Kennedy, had just been elected President of the United States, a copy of her first book, I Can Fly, for Jacqueline's daughter, who was then 3 years old. Jacqueline wrote back, "Oh, how perfectly sweet of you to send Caroline an autographed copy of one of her favorite books. This we will treasure." In the summer of 1961, Mary's niece Maggie, who was then 16, stayed with them for a few weeks. By this point, Maggie was aware of Mary's accomplishments in the world of art and design. "Well, I watched her working," she said. "She really comes alive when she paints. She worked very easily and very intensely." The effect of this was that Mary's family remained in close contact with the Blairs, while Lee's family, with the exception of Preston, slowly drifted away from them. Preston, it seems, remained close because his career interest overlapped with that of Lee. By the early 1960s, Preston was freelancing for Hanna-Barbera. All through these years, Walt remained in contact with Mary. During one planning or presentation trip for the New York World's Fair, either in 1961 or 1962, Walt and Lily visited Mary and Lee at their house. The four of them went down to Stepping Stone Park, where the Blairs kept their boat, and went sailing for the entire day. They all had a good time, Walt in particular. After spending days in the city, Walt was relieved to be out in Long Island, where no one all day recognized him or asked for an autograph. In this, Walt could see that though the Blairs were living near New York, they were, when home, far from the culture of New York City as well. Following that visit, Mary sent a request to Walt that if he was willing to let her son Donovan, who would be visiting Mary's sister Peggy, visit the studio with Peggy and her daughters that summer. "May he come and see you and bring you our love," Mary wrote. Maggie and her daughters, along with Donovan, visited in July, were given a studio tour, had lunch at the commissary, and spent time with Walt. As one niece recalled, "They had tomato juice cocktails in his office. He was very, very nice to us," she continued. "He took us to the set of the Flubber movie that Fred McMurray was making." Walt also arranged a trip to Disneyland for them, including seats for shows at both the Golden Horseshoe Saloon and the newly opened Tahitian Terrace. "Walt gave us vouchers to go on everything," Mary's niece explained. "All day long, dinner, anything we wanted, go to the head of the line. Very generous." After Mary heard of their experiences, she wrote Walt a note of thanks. "Seems you made four people mighty happy with your traditional all-out generosity and thoughtfulness," she began. But toward the end of the letter she added, "I'm still in freelance advertising and doing other odd jobs like 8 Fifth Avenue window arrangements for a perfume display." But in that almost surely was the suggestion that now that her boys were a little older, she might be open to some type of work arrangement in the not-too-distant future with Disney. Walt made a note of this possibility. For the Blairs, the summer of 1962 closed with a 2-week sailing trip up the Sound to Block Island, which was about 200 miles from where they lived. They traveled in a 28-foot cruising sloop that Lee had recently purchased. The time away from home was partially designed to take Lee away from the stress he now experienced at work. He was drinking too much. At times he exploded with anger. He was aware of how his employees saw him. "I was the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of the animation business," he said. The stress came partially from the expansion of his firm. By the 1960s, TV was a large business. Everything from ads to title sequences to short programs. "We ended up with one of the largest sound stages in New York and a huge payroll," Lee explained. As was now his habit, he understood his life and troubles in part through the lens of Walt Disney. "In those days," Lee explained, "I kind of remembered how Disney was kind of berated because he was nervous and jumpy and everything. And I could see why. Because he was keeping ahead of that big payroll." That is, Lee began to justify some of his outbursts at work because he remembered that Walt, another film producer, had clearly been affected by stress that came from managing a large company. So I kind of felt for that guy, Walt, having had that experience. But in this also, Lee again saw himself as a person who now occupied the role of a Walt Disney, as someone who from a business perspective might be Walt's equal. At times, the stress from Lee's job became too much for him to manage. He had 200 employees, which was too many for him to oversee. His firm's main offices were just off Central Park on Columbus Circle in New York, and the sound stages were a few blocks away on Lexington Avenue. Lee faced endless problems. He found that some employees slacked off at work, and he discovered others stole from him. He found that his business took nearly all of his time, leaving him little opportunities to paint. He turned to booze. He was great in the morning, one person recalled, but by the afternoon he was smashed. Some recalled him to be a fun drunk. He would tell funny stories. But at least one of Lee's employees recalled that at times, likely when overwhelmed, he could be a nasty drunk. Some days, Lee would try to practice art at work. Even though he was president of the company, he occasionally roughed out storyboards for commercials. At times, it was clear, even to Mary, that he was having affairs, looking for a type of validation he couldn't find at home or inside the company he owned. Some of Mary's friends saw the struggles Lee experienced more clearly than did Lee. I'm sure that Lee loved her very much, Alice Davis later explained, but the conflict of the profession, along with a love, got terribly mixed up. There were, however, other times that Lee fell back into his better self. As the kids grew up, their friends learned that he and Mary had worked for Walt Disney and had helped create animated features. Around their children's school, they became minor celebrities. People who had worked on Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi, and other films. Lee also invited Donovan's friends over to the house and also to sail with them on the boat. Most of these friends had a positive view of Lee, as in social settings he was still charming. Lee was very ebullient, one of Donovan's friends explained, generous, friendly, and immediately accepted you as a close buddy. During this period, Mary's career continued to expand in unexpected ways. Based on clothes she had designed for herself for years, she began to design clothes for the Beverly Page line. "Well, there's an illustration of a woman in a suit, a nice jacket and skirt," one relative later explained, and the caption says, "By Mary Blair for Beverly Page." Mary created a line of skirts with bright colors and interesting patterns, as well as floral dresses and even sleeveless tweed vests. They were sold exclusively through Lord & Taylor's. Also during this period, she saw that Lee was pulling away from the family, unable to find whatever satisfaction he needed there, leaving her to focus on the boys. Donovan was interested in art and perhaps had the potential to succeed there. Kevin, on the other hand, was somewhat quiet, a little slow to pick up language subjects, but was very good with math and interested in technology. Though Mary could easily coach Donovan towards his interest in art, she would need to look for opportunities to encourage Kevin, as his interest in math and technology were far outside of subjects that came easily to her. In this, she was reminded a little of paintings she had made for Walt 15 years earlier, images of Cinderella. To her, those paintings had been an extension of her life shortly after she had moved to New York, with Lee enthusiastic to start a new business and she working from home. But now she felt a new type of isolation drawing down around her, something more difficult to define than the isolation she'd experienced after the war. Her mothers and sisters were far away, as were many of her friends. Her husband, though close, was occupied elsewhere. In Cinderella, the girl's problems were solved through a fairy godmother. Since she'd been a girl, Mary kept a light religious outlook, but she also knew that no magic was heading her way to solve any of these problems. These problems were things that she would have to face by herself. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Our plan, at least right now, is to continue our story of Mary Blair. Just as with Disney legend Herb Ryman, Mary leaves the Disney operation and then comes back when the time is right. And in our next episode, we'll begin to set the stage for Mary's return. Though in this role, she'll be doing very different work than she did for Disney in the 1940s and early 1950s. Anyway, that's the plan for next week, assuming, of course, that Disney doesn't drop significant news releases in the next few days. Also, if you've been enjoying this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or one of our many other public feeds, we would love to have you join us as a subscriber over on Bandcamp. On iTunes and the other public feeds, you'll find 100 episodes. But on Bandcamp, you'll find over 400. I've been doing this show now for over a dozen years, since 2013. So there are a near endless set of stories about the history of the Disney company, about Walt, about the people who worked there, on Bandcamp. Episodes that are not available anywhere else. But the best reason to become a monthly subscriber is to support the work we do here. Everything from on-site research and archives, special collection units, and private collections, to interviews with early Disney employees, to the preservation of documents related to the early history of animation and to theme parks, to the analysis of current trends in films and amusement, all of which, of course, feeds into materials that make this weekly podcast. Hopefully, these pursuits are important to you as well. And if so, you can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes today. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.